So, let's see. I probably should make notes, but I'm going to try to wing it. I do know something about this subject, as it's, you know, part of my growing up and coming to adulthood, and the Israeli-Palestinian question, and excuse me, the Jewish question has been ongoing. Thus, the Jewish question, I should say. After that, the Israeli-Palestinian question. Um, the Jewish question has been ongoing for at least since October 7th. In a really intensive way. Um, but a Facebook friend just posted the old canard about George Soros, and the conspiracy nutters, with, of course, anti-Semitic, of which there are plenty among the Ukrainians and Irish and other peasant peoples, who then wash up on the shores of the U.S., especially in shitholes like Chicago. Are prone to say, George Soros and the Bilderbergs and the Jews are controlling our lives, government, society, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and all recalls to mind August Babel's book, which I haven't read because I kind of grew up with the complaints continually. Um, but his book, The Socialism of Fools, and kind of substituting when these people, mopes, substitute class analysis for saying it's the Jews. Well, you have to look at the position of Jews in American society, and excuse me, uh, like, what is it? I guess 40% of Jews, I believe the number is, approve of Israel's war against, or whatever you want to say. It's war against, ethnic cleansing, genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, for the most part, Gaza. And, so roughly speaking, we can say 40% of American Jews are shit. But, that leaves the other 60%, overwhelmingly of which are shitlibs, basically. Bernie Sanders type liberals, or, I don't know, pick your, not absolutely shitty Democrat. Well, they're all pretty much shit. But, Bernie Sanders represents, he's the mirage of the last of the Bund, that sort of Menshevik Jewish tradition. And even, I'm sure, many, Jews whose forebears were communists, probably, maybe most, when you look at who came to America when, they would have been overwhelmingly proletarianized and overwhelmingly from, the Russian Polish Empire, and if they came from, well, that's a whole other long, complicated story, so let's not get into that. But anyway, so 60%, vaguely speaking, of Jews in America are, let's call them left liberal, really liberal, liberal, maybe left liberal. So which is better than probably 80% of the Irish Americans and 70% of Italian Americans, so-called Italian Americans, mostly Sicilians and Calabrians, and excuse me, and what other groups? Ukrainians, Jesus Christ, those who came. I'm thinking mostly those who came after World War II. Just fascist garbage. Asian Americans, by far, the number is more than inverted. Asian Americans, I would guess, 75% of them are so fascist they would make Hitler blush. and that's only moderated by the recent influx of kind of Menshevik left liberal Chinese, and so but that 75%, yeah, they're fucking horrible. If I had my way, it they already hate me. I had a boss she was a fascist whore, Korean American scum. So, in the scheme of things, in terms as at least as far as America goes, the American Jews are not far from the worst. Now, there's Jews in America at the top, like Victoria Nuland or Chuck Schumer or these neocon scum, or who else are we talking about? Oh God. Well, George Soros, of course. I don't know. I don't keep track of the whole Jews cabal running the world, allegedly. But their numbers are, I don't know what percent of the Jews that would be. Like my cousin Bob is a Jew with money. He was Bloomberg's in-house tax attorney, so certainly he might be one of them, right? Excuse me. Like serving the people who are serving the court Jews, let's call them. The real Jews with money. But that's probably a fairly small number, although they're very visible. They're outsized in their numbers for various historical reasons, and whatever. In terms of George Soros and Hungary, though, I was just looking at a memory on Facebook, and I couldn't remember the name, but it popped up in memories. It was, I believe his first name was Rudolf Vrbo, however you say that, Varbo, let's say, if I have the Slavicism, correct. And he was the Bohemian Czech Jew, or Slovakian, actually, technically. He was Slovakian Jew, who was basically, he had more gumption. He was a youth. He was like, fuck that, I'm not reporting for deportation to any camp. And then I guess eventually they caught him, but somehow it was either later in the war, but he was young and healthy. They put him in Auschwitz. He survived Auschwitz and escaped and ended up going to Hungary. And he and I believe another comrade wrote a report. And they were like, trying to warn the Jews of Budapest, basically, of Hungary. There was like 800,000, I think, total. Same number as Belarus, actually. And, a friend of mine from Macedonia is upset about a national question. But anyway, so, former Yugoslavia. Anyway, so, Varbo, let's call him, I don't know, VRBO. You tell me how to pronounce it. I think roughly Varbo. So Varbo and this other person, Jewish, I assume, write a report, and they hand it to the leadership of Budapest Jews. And of course, those leaders, being socially prominent, bourgeois, are Zionists. And so out of the 800,000, 400,000 have been shipped out to Auschwitz and murdered. There's another 400,000 in Budapest waiting to be shipped out. And Varbo tries to warn these Jews through the Zionists, Judenreiters, the Jewish heads of the Jewish Council, let's call them, in Budapest. Look, this isn't a holding camp, a concentration camp. This is an extermination camp. You are about to all be murdered, 400,000 of you. Well, what did the Zionist Judenreiters do with that information that was won at great cost? They took it to the Gestapo and they said, hey, look, we know you're going to murder these other 400,000, but, if you let us go to Israel, we won't warn them, and we'll allow, basically we'll allow you to murder all those 400,000 Jews. So that shows you the kind of vermin, traitorous, bourgeois nature of the what these bourgeois Jews basically and Zionists, but the class nature, in any nation, right? You'll get. I was just reading about like the Albanian landlord scum, Zohach or something, driving out the reformist Albanian who wanted to preserve feudalism. So he was a scumbag too, but whatever. He was less reactionary and nasty. But you had that within Albanians. You had that within Uzbeks, the Basmachi. You had that, of course, in Germany. Scheidemann murdering Luxembourg and Liebknecht, etc. The other point is, in Hungary, I talked to an archivist in the family town in Slovenia, and we were talking about Hungarians, and he was like, "Oh yeah, their reputation is basically they're fascist Huns." Asiatic savage fascists. And I looked up through AI how many Hungarians, actively collaborated with the German fascist, invaders, occupiers, marchers on the Soviet Union. And 1 out of 9 Hungarians were like, "Oh yeah, sign us up. We'll go fight the Judeo-Bolshevik menace." So that goes to show you, 1 out of 9, my God. And, the French, they hardly put up any resistance. And actually they attacked these Allied prisoners during the German occupation as well. Was noted by some Russian news sources recently. So, just Hungary, Eastern Middle Europa, it's just historically in the last 100 years, it's a shithole of revanche, hatred of progress, and hatred of the East, hatred of Jews, hatred of Reds, and hatred of Yugoslavia, I guess one could say. So, yeah. So, that's the point from which many of these Zionists and Jews with money, and probably many of the Jews in America who are in those rarefied circles that help make these policies and carry them out, like Victoria Nuland, they come from bourgeois Jewish families, but they basically are the enemy of humanity because they're bourgeois. And being Jewish it's useful because then the non-Jewish ruling class in Western Europe or the USA can point to them and say, see, they're for the Jewish people, and if you're against them, you're anti-Semitic. You're against the Jews. Well, what the hell do you mean the Jews? Most Jews historically, in the last 100 years, were communists or supporters of the Soviet Union, I would venture to say. I mean, they were all murdered, so you can't take a poll anymore. And even when they were alive, they were under the dictatorship of, maybe Western Ukraine, Poland, basically was the political empire there. So they were, under the dictatorship of the Polish Empire. And, but the Soviet Union was immensely popular among Jews from 1919 until practically the fall of the Soviet Union, although that gets into a complicated question of, mistakes and crimes made by the Soviet bureaucrats, but nevertheless, yeah, so, when some Zionists or Jews with money claim to represent, like the Jews, historically, that's bullshit. And it's actually shitting on the memory of all of those Jews, probably most of whom, to one extent or another, even as socialists perhaps, supported either the Soviet Union or, they were anti-Zionist. Even my right-wing Menshevik grandparents were anti-Zionist. And my father, my CIA dad, he wasn't, what? He wasn't a supporter of Israel, really. So he was very skeptical of Israel. So what else can I say? Now, I guess nowadays, the brainwashing and the social promotion among Jews, now they're petit bourgeois, most Jews. So they believe that bullshit that the, elite bourgeois Jews spew. And there is no real, there's no Soviet Union left. There's no communist alternative. So, they can't, there's very little for them to grasp at. Otherwise, like in the last however many, let's say 50, 60 years, or certainly 30 years. At least 30 years. There hasn't been an alternative power out there really that would, historically, that appealed to the Jews like the Soviet Union did. So here we are, and as far as George Soros. I guess, he was a bourgeois Jew, and he was saved because of his father's money and position. And he was put in a horrible position where these murderers, murdered people of his persuasion, let's say, Hungarian Jews. But, probably most of those Hungarian Jews were impoverished, and he was bourgeois, number one. And I think really a lot of it probably, whatever, psychological issues he has, say he's a psychopath maybe, or a sociopath. And so that other people's feelings, he doesn't have any empathy, right? Quite possibly. I'm not a psychiatrist, and even if I were one, I couldn't, analyze him, through a TV screen. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that, I don't know, he's a psychopath, or let's say he's a psychopath. But all the same, that was his reaction as basically a 14-year-old boy, young, just became a young man, right? So it's like I had not a teacher, but an elder in Japan when I lived in Japan. Professor, I think his name was Takahashi. It's been many years now. And he sort of apologized, and he said, I wish we could have done more against the fascists. Because, you knew I was Jewish, and the Soviet Union still barely existed, or didn't exist, I think, when we talked, but it had just been almost destroyed practically. He felt bad that, and he was the same age as George Soros, I think, at that time, roughly, maybe he was 16 or 15, I forget. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I'm sorry you have to go through that, and I appreciate your sentiment, but you were just one kid. What the hell could you have done under Tojo's and Hirohito's dictatorship? Like pretty much nothing. I mean, you could have done, I guess, something, more than symbolic, but then they would have caught you and just chopped off your head, like literally. So, and then I wouldn't have met you and had all these forums, attended all these forums on Japanese society and, politics, etc. So it was kind of pointless to think that someone, Professor Takahashi or George Soros, when, you're like however old, you're going to be able to change any of that, So, but I think, I think the broader point is that this is capitalism, that capitalism birthed fascism and made Hungary what it was and is, and made George Soros what he, became. And so, like if you're a Professor Takahashi, you're a more moral person. You do something constructive in the world. If you're George Soros, unless you live in a socialist society, you're going to go off and become a currency or speculator and destroy the economy of Malaysia. But it's very rare, I think, under capitalist society that, well, yeah, you do get revolutionaries, but, in a place like Hungary, fascist Hungary, or, whatever, Hungary in the last 100 years, well, let's just say fascist Hungary, you know, the worst impulses are going to be encouraged, and under American capitalism from 1991, the worst impulses were encouraged, and that's the world George Soros lived in. So if you don't want psychopaths like, crashing the economy and opening the borders and letting millions of barbarians in, counter to the second plank of the First International, then, we have to overthrow capitalism. So, but, in the meantime, it's not the Jews. It's capitalism. So.